Welcome to Panzer Museum Munster, and I have decided to borrow Hilary Doyle one more time for a little casual stroll through, well, at least the first half of the museum up until the end of World War II. And all we're going to do is, as we're wandering around, we're just going to talk about some of the developments, and both technical and doctrinal, in the German armour community. And, well, we'll just see what happens. It's a nice casual chat.
Okay, good.
So, well, I guess we start World War I.
Yes, well, of course, the Germans hadn't planned to have a tank-type system. They just reacted to what they saw coming across from the English side, and they took a tracked vehicle that they had been developing for supply called the Oberlandwagen, and they put armour plate on it to make the A7V. So that's where that comes from, but it's very much the same concept as the British land ships.
Do they have a doctrine for these, or was it just, oh, let's just build it and throw it forward and see what happens?
No, they were really reacting. They had developed tank units using captured British tanks, but this was their own manufacture based on this Oberlandwagen that they had in development prior to that.
They had armoured cars and whatnot prior.
Oh yeah, armoured cars existed for quite some time. They were used mainly for street activities, that they weren't good enough for the front.
All right, so the next thing, as we're coming around the corner, we're going to come to the LK2, or I think it's actually Swedish SM, but it's...
Yeah, this actually comes from Sweden, but it is actually a German development. It was the first real tank that the Germans tried to bring in. It's not dissimilar to the British Whippet in its concept, but it was a proper tank, and it was also a response to the Renault FT-17s, which they had seen coming in 1917-18. Where you had a turret and a vehicle that could traverse, whereas here you drove along and you machine gunned the trenches from the side and so forth. That was the idea.
But in terms of construction, it's basically an armoured car that just happens to have tracks. This makes no difference.
Yeah, effectively, it could go cross country in those bad conditions on the Western Front.
Okay. So after World War I, I'm sorry, the bad Germans, you may not have any more tanks. What happens between when they're banned and all of a sudden they're stampeding across Europe? Obviously something happened.
Well, they had a program to develop tanks from an experimental point of view, even hidden behind the treaty. They had a deal with Russia, so they had a big testing station in Kazan where they brought 2 of each type. They had a number of different so-called Großtraktor, which is a code name for their medium tank, and they tried out various technologies there. And they also had a Leichte tractor, which was from each one of these were from 3 different manufacturers to test out different types of technology. And the Leichte tractor would have become, eventually, the ideas would have gone into their light tanks, and the Großtraktor, it went into things like the Panzer IV.
So in the meantime, all they do is play around with things like this.
Yeah, well, that's a First World War armoured car. Again, as you can see, you couldn't bring that across country at all. But in fact, they didn't really have the industrial capacity or finance to introduce a big tank building program. So they bought a Vickers Carden Lloyd tractor from the British, and they developed that into the Panzer I as a quick, inexpensive solution to getting tracked vehicles around for training and so forth. But the battle concept for a Panzer I was that you basically swarmed an anti-tank gun line, and you were supported then by Panzer IVs who used their artillery pieces to knock out the corresponding anti-tank guns. But if you had 45 of these things coming at you across the field, they were quite capable of overrunning a position.
Tank guns, you'll get 1 or 2 of them, and that'll be...
Yeah, they had the calculations on how many they would lose out of each unit in an attack, but the idea was you had a swarm of these coming at you.
So they sent those, and we got a Panzer II turret around the corner here. They sent those to Spain for the Civil War. How much of an influence was the experience in Spain? Some people say it's been overstated.
Well, it gave them a good chance to try out things and see what happened in difficult conditions, in trying to run an army abroad and so forth. So they learned a lot from that, and they learned with the machine gun tanks that there was a problem against the Russian BT 7s and so forth. The BT-26. And then they brought out the Panzer II was in development. The main thing there was to get a tank big enough that would carry a 2-centimeter gun, because a 2-centimeter autocannon, you could fire a magazine of 10 rounds, rapid fire, and it had a Sprengenat, a high explosive bullet, as well as an anti-tank round. So it was actually quite capable.
Now, if you compare even the Panzer I to the T-26s, the Vickers, all the other tanks that were out there in the field, they're welded, and everybody else is still playing with rivets and bolts, usually.
Yeah, the Germans realised even in the First World War that riveting brings weight, and they wanted to get rid of the weight, so they were looking for compact engines, welding. They had the technology for the welding. They owned the patents for a lot of the welding technologies that didn't become available elsewhere in the world until after the Second World War, when those were confiscated.
So we're coming up now to an 88 flak. Now, there are people that say, oh yeah, Rommel invented the idea of the 88 as an anti-tank gun in France. And this seems stupid to me, because obviously they had armor-piercing rounds. So somebody somewhere had the idea, oh, you can take this big, huge gun and fire a mile straight up. What would happen if we aim it sideways?
Yeah, well, that actually is an outcome of the Spanish Civil War, because there was a flak unit with half-tracks towing the 88s down in Spain, and they were used to break a Republican attack on the nationalist forces, and they were using flak trajectory, and they were using them as anti-tank guns effectively, and that's where the idea came in. And then in 1938, when Hitler decided he was going to go in and take Czechoslovakia, he ordered that 88s be mounted on half-tracks and be rapidly converted into ground fire guns, and 50 88s were converted to that.
Well, you love half-tracks, but we'll come back to them a little bit later, because there's a few more. Panzer IV. Okay, so now we've come to the support tanks. Spoiler alert, we're going to cover this one in detail, the two of us, a little later on in another video. So let's not spend too much time on this right now. We have a horse. Of course, even the Panzer divisions had horses, right?
Yes, the German army had more horses than everybody else during the Second World War.
It was a great example of propaganda, is that every photograph was a tank.
Yeah.
But I was listening to a German historian. He was saying that there was this idea in the German army that in the invasion of France in 1944, the Germans would have the advantage, because the Allies would have to ship all the fuel and whatnot across the water to get to France, whereas the German army, being horse-drawn, well, the fuel was all around them. The horses could eat, and that would give them a strategic advantage.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so another spoiler alert. I've already filmed an inside hatch in the Panzer III, and my opinion after being in it is this is the best tank in the world in 1939.
Yeah.
I mean, it's big enough to be comfortable. Everybody can use it well. Yeah, the 37 was a little small, but it was good enough still.
And the Germans sold Panzer IIIs to Russia and delivered them in 1940. So the Russians had plenty of opportunity to investigate them and see what the good points were and the bad points and so forth.
Yeah. But, again, so we're going to come back to that in a different show. We've got, of course, Panther behind here.
Yes.
Some people say the best tank of World War II.
Well, what they were trying to do, besides deal with the threat on the Eastern Front from the very good Russian designs, they were also trying to build a vehicle that would, like the Panzer III, have a longevity in terms of capability for the future, a platform that they could adapt the turret and adapt it to different types of guns and so forth. And we see over the couple of years of production of Panther that actually was taking place, that it was moving forward. And they were integrating in the final versions they were planning for after the end of the war. They were planning for integrated range finding and so forth.
So we have the famous interleaved suspension.
Yes.
The thing behind this is what?
Well, it gives you a very finely distributed suspension on a Panzer III. Each torsion bar, or set of torsion bars, is a separate bogie. Here you've got them and you get twice the number of wheels, so you get a very even ground pressure, and again that means that you can go across country at a very steady rate without causing problems for the crew, and you've got a potential platform. Again, developments for the end of the war, they were coming out with stabilized gun sights and so forth that could be used for firing on the move. They were working towards that.
When the German soldiers that are operating these, or the Tigers, are getting these multi-leaf wheels, were they not writing back saying, this is terrible because it takes us 3 hours just to change a wheel?
Yes, that was a problem. They learned from what they had on these in the mud situation, and they moved where, this is called Schachtel-Laufwerk, where the wheel 2, 1, 1. So, and you had to take out 3 to get at 1. So they overcame that in the design for the Tiger. They redesigned it so that you didn't have that problem.
So how much over-influence did Uncle Adolf have in this thing? I mean, if Adolf had left the designers to do what the designers wanted to do, would it still have looked like this?
Well, what happened was for design, that the design comes from the Waffenamt. So the political guys would have been demanding things like bigger guns, heavier armor and so forth, because that's politically expedient. And that would have been influencing ultimately what the Waffenamt would be asking for. But primarily the Waffenamt was saying, we want a tank that has this horsepower of engine, this type of gearbox, this sort of armor. It was being influenced, but it's the designers are still the guys that are specifying the vehicle in the Waffenamt.
Move on a little bit then. We, of course, we have our T-34 to the right here, which, I mean, was the T-34 actually a surprise to the Germans because they'd been working together for so long?
They were a surprise, yes, because they hadn't come across this. I mean, the big change was the wide track and the use of the sloped armor, because Dr. Rao, prior to that, had disliked the idea of sloping the armor because it complicated the inside of the vehicle. And have you done the inside of a T-34? It's pretty cramped.
Not of an 80, not of a 76, of an 85. Okay. Yes. I mean, yeah. You got the sloping armor, takes up room.
Takes an awful lot of room. Yeah, and you compare that to a Panzer. Well, a Panzer 4. Look how long it is in comparison. But there's no doubt about it. The wide track were the big thing that gave you flotation in poor conditions, and the sloped armor was a benefit.
Did the Germans not know even of the KV series?
I don't think that.
You hear these stories that the German army starts in Barbarossa and all of a sudden their 37s are going up against KVs.
Yes.
And given how often that they'd been exchanging information, I find it difficult to believe that.
Well, I suppose if you're exchanging, the closer you keep your enemies, the better it is. So they knew, they kept the information that they needed to private.
All right. So we have a fake Tiger, everybody's favorite vehicle.
Yeah, well,
favorite vehicle?
No, but you can see that they've already started to change the suspension. You began the shortage of the rubber in that Germany had. They've gone to steel-tired road wheels. Now they still have a rubber tire inside. That's this bulging section there, but the rim is a steel rim, and that saves on rubber.
I don't think there's very much to say about the Tiger. I mean, it's incredibly famous. Why?
Well, it was a very spectacular tank at its time. It was a very heavy tank and so forth. It was designed for a particular type of thing. It's not a reaction to anything that was coming from Russia. This was being designed long before because they had the Panzer IV as a support tank, but they also then went on. They were having the DW, which was for a heavy support tank for breakthrough, and then this was the outcome of that.
Now, I've heard you say the same thing about the Panther. The Panther was not designed in particular to respond to the T-34.
Well, yes and no, but it was heavily influenced by what they'd found on the front at that stage. But there was designs in place coming along that just hadn't materialized by the time the Panther was being needed. But it's more obvious in the Tiger, where you had several other designs that were prior to that were adapted when they came to it.
So we're now approaching your favorite. What is it about you and half-tracks? You love half-tracks.
No, I don't love half-tracks. It's just they're a tremendous part of the story of German armour, because they had all this investment in these armoured personnel carriers, which were based on a half-track chassis. And that was possible because the Germans had patents on steel production and armor production that made it possible to have very thin armor plate giving high protection. So you get the majority, okay, the front of this thing here is a 14.5 plate, and the driver plate is, but the rest of it, the sides are made from 5.5 millimeter and 8 millimeter armor plate, and the Allies were not capable of manufacturing such high quality thin plate, but that gave them the opportunity to put their guys in these armoured personnel carriers and motorise their infantry. That's the interesting part of the story. The vehicles, okay, technology wise I'm always fascinated in that, but that's the important thing.
It can be argued that a half-track provides you the complications of a tracked vehicle with the limitations of a wheeled vehicle. The Americans kind of got around this by keeping it a very, very simple system with just a regular truck differential. It's basically a truck with tracks on it. The Germans went a slightly different route.
Yeah, the front wheels, which provide the steering for the majority of the time, are not driven. But the system they had on the steering was when you hard locked over, the information would be transferred to the tracks, and then you get a differential in the tracks.
Overcomplicated for the road.
Yeah, it's tricky enough. Yeah. But they were working very hard to produce a fully tracked armoured personnel carrier. So by 1944 they had perfected a design called the Quechan, which was a torsion bar suspension, interleaved suspension, and very, very high speed and so forth. But they hadn't got the industrial capacity to switch over to that at that stage.
Okay, so 38Ts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when they moved into the Czech Republic in 1939, they found that the Czechs were building a tank based on this suspension and so forth. The Praga company had already developed the 38T. Previously, Skoda had produced a 35T, so they inherited capacity already on the production line for 150 38Ts, and they had nearly 300 35Ts, which was a bonus for the German army at the time that had very few tanks readily available in the medium scale. But they went on producing that. It was a cheap, cheerful design, and when the 37 millimeter gun that was on the 38T was no longer worth having, they converted them to self-propelled platforms. So this one has the PAC 40 on it. And then in 1944, to use the capacity of the Czech industry, they redesigned the 38T chassis and made it into the Jagdpanzer 38, which is not really like the Panzer IV, Jagdpanzer IV. This is meant to be a self-propelled anti-tank gun. It's the direct replacement for that. It's a 75 millimeter anti-tank gun primarily. That's the idea. And it's although people think that it has quite substantial armor plate and so forth, this is Siemens Martin armor, which is a First World War concept armor, which is not as strong as the armor that's used on the main battle tanks. So a 60 millimeter here is roughly equivalent to a 30 millimeter face hardened plate that you get on a Panzer III, and this side armor of 20 millimeters is equivalent to the 14.5 on the front of a 251 half-track.
So a 75, a British 75 or an American.
Oh yeah, but they're not meant to be a combat vehicle. They are anti-tank gun. You go around and you have the advantages of plenty of protection for the crew, but you're meant to go and do a defensive hiding in the bushes and so forth. And as that, they're very good because they're very low. And again, they were able to produce 500 a month. It was fantastic.
You won't believe how many people are arguing whether or not the commander is on the right rear of this vehicle and not the loader. Well, everything I have seen in the manuals and the operator said the commander is on the right rear.
He's here.
Yeah.
That hatch there.
Yeah.
He sits in behind the in beside the engine because they were trying to pack an awful lot into a very small little space.
So if that was the self-propelled anti-tank gun, the WWII Panzers, we've got two of them here, prototype and a production variant.
Well, that's a replacement for the Sturmgeschütz. That was the idea of that you got a modern design for a Sturmgeschütz. You had they didn't, with the Sturmgeschütz wasn't meant to be rapid moving, so the suspension from a Panzer IV was adequate for that. So that was the idea. A better protected than a normal Sturmgeschütz.
Of course, eventually they put the Panther's gun on it.
Yeah, they put the long gun into it and so forth. It was a pretty effective device.
This is much bigger.
A Panther, yes. Well, that's the ultimate German tank destroyer with an 88mm gun in a Panther chassis. Luxurious amount of space inside.
Now, I've seen the photographs from your friends over at Wield fixing up one of these things, and I mean the way they were getting the transmission out, they had to pull the gun off, set it aside, pull the transmission out.
Correct.
So it was almost as if the designers always emphasized combat capability over the ability to keep something maintained. Was there an argument between the logistician branch and the combat arm?
Well, they had to improvise on all of this. They had to make choices, and as far as they were concerned, it was relatively straightforward. They knew how long it would take to, properly trained Werkstatt company could do this job in a fixed length of time. They knew exactly what they were facing, what you had to do, how many bolts you had to remove, and how you lifted the gun out. And they had special devices. They didn't just do it with any old ropes and tackle. They had a tool for lifting, for guiding the transmission out. And the Panther transmission by this time is actually getting quite reliable.
I was trying to dig into your book on the improvements that found. The impression I got was that they improved the final drives on the WWII Panther, but the Panther not so much for some reason. That's the impression I got from your book.
No. By the later part of the G production and so forth, the Panther is becoming quite reliable.
RSO wagon there with a pack?
Yeah, well, that's a tracked lorry. It's a Shire 1500 lorry, basically, with an air-cooled engine, and they designed tracks for it, so for cross-country in muddy conditions. That was that, and then they were trying out the idea of putting in a Pack 40 on it, but they built 50 of those, but it wasn't a great success, so they left it over.
So speaking of great successes, unsung hero.
Yeah, the Sturmgeschütz was the ultimate success story. This vehicle was invented as the bunkerbuster the first ones came out in 1940 and were used in France with the short 75, and at that time heavy armour because of 50mm armour, but this version now you're up to 80mm of armour, and you've got the long L48 gun, coaxial machine gun in the final version, a remote controlled roof. I don't know, it's not there, but the remote control machine gun on the roof, and they were really successful, and they had the huge ratio of kills for the vehicle.
And we're still using the Panzer III chassis.
Still using the Panzer III chassis, so you've got all the benefits of the performance of a Panzer III, no problem at all. Now, what you Sturmgeschütz is an artillery device. It was owned by the artillery until Guderian became chief of Panzertruppen in 43, I think it was, and then a certain proportion of Sturmgeschütz got allocated to Panzer divisions as an alternative to tanks. But a Sturmgeschütz for the artillery and a Sturmgeschütz for the tank guys are mainly differentiated by radio systems, different radio systems.
So when they decided that they were going to simplify production and drop the Panzer III chassis,
yes.
So you say the WWII Panzer IV was going to be that replacement, but in the end that never happened.
That never happened. And the final plan was actually to have a 38D for German production versions of the 38 Jagdpanzer. They were going to have a 38D with a long 75 and so forth. Very inexpensive production, where they could produce 1,000 of them a month. That was the idea.
Right, so the Germans seem to go very heavily into self-propelled assault artillery.
They tried out on a Sturmgeschütz chassis. They tried out a 15 centimeter in Stalingrad, very successful in building, attacking buildings and so forth. So the Sturmpanzer IV was the development of that more sophisticated superstructure and so forth. But primarily, it was a design to be used against heavily fortified buildings and so forth. And with a 15 centimeter gun, it's quite a devastating device.
I see they've gone to the steel lug wheels.
Yeah, that's an example of, because this is a much heavier vehicle, this is a 28-ton vehicle, they've gone to the steel tire wheels and steel return rollers.
So now moving to sort of, this is the self-propelled artillery.
This is artillery, completely artillery, and you've got here the concept that the Germans had for artillery, whether it was wheeled or horse-drawn or anything else. You had a 10.5 was your light field howitzer. That was the gun that was used for laying down the battery fire, and the 15 centimeter was the counter battery fire. So a unit with the self-propelled artillery was made up of Vespa for the 10.5 and Hummel for the 15 centimeter. The Vespas were the ones that rapid fire battery fire, and then the Hummels were for counter battery against anybody that attacked there.
How did the counter battery work? Because they didn't have radar back then.
Oh, they had fairly sophisticated optical and sound ranging and so forth. And they had, based on a Panzer III, they had Beobachtungspanzer. So they had observation vehicles that watched what was going on, ranged, just looked for where the shot was falling and ranged in on that. And then they were having half-tracks converted into Beobachtungs as well for artillery officers to spot what was going on.
One of the things that kind of caught my attention as I was going through with the Panzer tracks and the SP artillery was that in all of World War II, only one battery of 4 guns ever used vehicles that were purpose designed as self-propelled artillery. It was the Schutzpanzer IVs.
Sorry, as you said that one again, I'm missing the point.
These are ersatz interim weapon systems. So, as a vehicle that the Germans designed from the ground up to be a self-propelled artillery vehicle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the artillery people were always looking for vehicles, but they were being blocked by the Waffenamt, who didn't want to give them the production capacity available. But they did design artillery vehicles, and the artillery particularly wanted a vehicle where you could dismount the gun, and you could get 360-degree traverse. That's what they wanted. They developed, there was a Heuschrecke and other vehicles, and then at the end of the war there were lots of interesting designs for self-propelled artillery that never came to fruition because the industrial capacity wasn't there.
All right, so now we'll talk quickly about the 234, and of course you got the model of the 222 in there. So German reconnaissance units seemed to be sort of heavier than those of the Allies. Well,
in the glass case you had the small 222 armoured car, and that was basically a four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering armoured car. They were used as scout cars in the early part of the war, and the concept there was you had a 221, which was a scout car, two-man device, much smaller armoured envelope than a 222, which had a 2-centimetre gun. And then there was a 223, which is a radio car, and the scout car, the 221, and the radio car did the business, and the 222 was the protection for that unit. But they were to stay away from, they were not meant to get involved in a combat, and they were to, find and run.
But when you start looking at the 8 rads, you got a 75, you got the Puma with the 5-centimetre, and this is obviously not just there for the sake of hiding and running.
No, the 8-wheeler, well, it had a 2-centimetre, was its primary weapon originally, and it had radio sets in it, and it had the command vehicle, which was full of radios. But then this was the later version, the 234, where the chassis was basically the same 8-wheeler chassis with some modernization, but it has a Tatra air-cooled diesel engine in it. And that also was meant to have either a 2-centimetre gun, a 5-centimetre gun, but these adaptations with the long pack and so forth, that's just a panic move to protect the unit from heavy Soviet vehicles.
So now we get to the King Tiger,
Yep.
famous vehicle, a breakthrough tank in a period of time where they're getting crushed. Is that a wasted effort?
Well, yes, but I mean, when you're involved in the situation, you don't think you're being crushed, and you believe that there's going to be opportunities again to use this type of breakthrough situation. And it was used in a local sense when they had to attack with the formation of these. But the problem at the end of the war was everything was going wrong. The fuel supplies were poor, and the replacements and the troops were in bad condition and so forth.
Right, so Maybach has been making the engines for all these.
Yes.
What has Porsche been doing? Because they're famous for their electrical motors, that the whole Porsche system never worked out.
Yeah, well, the Porsche design for heavy tanks was, he believed that you avoided the mechanical gearboxes and that you went for the electrical drives. And to a large extent that was true. It was very successful, the electrical drives. The problem was the Porsche wanted to invent very sophisticated modern engines, not unlike this here Tatra, for tanks, but you can't develop a high-powered engine in a matter of years. You need years to develop such a sophisticated engine, and all his designs failed because the engines were not able to do the job rather than anything else. The electrical gearbox, the electrical drive to the wheels and the generators and so forth, they all worked perfectly well, and very good results from Ferdinands in Russia, despite the propaganda on them. They were a very successful vehicle that had a huge kill ratio, and the mobility of a mouse, for example, which was a somewhat silly design in my view, being so big, but the performance, cross-country performance, and its ability to get out of muddy conditions and so forth is outstanding.
So why didn't he just take, when he's making the Porsche Tiger, the Type 101, why didn't he just take Maybach? Okay, look, my own design isn't working. Let's just take Maybachs, put them in, and then submit that to the contract.
Well, I suppose, I mean, the German industry, the German war effort is not a centralized control arrangement. These are independent financial bodies, companies, bidding for contracts. So Porsche is supporting his design with a brand new Simmering Steyr engine, and they're hoping to win this contract, and they in effect design a tank that becomes eventually the Ferdinand with Maybach engines in it. But the Tiger that we looked at before is the replacement for the Porsche Tiger. And the Porsche Tiger was scrapped because the engines weren't going to be available. But for example, the turrets were used on normal Tigers. The Tiger in Bovington has a turret that was originally for one of those Porsche Tigers.
It had to be converted from electrical to hydraulic.
Yeah, and it looks a little bit different on the outside if you know what to look for.
I have to say I don't.
Well, there.
I'm not that good. All right, well, I think we've come to the end of the World War II section, so I'm going to let you go back to your measuring or
Thank you.
serial number investigations, or whatever it is that you do to keep yourself occupied in these places.
Yeah.
All right,
good.
Well, hope you found it interesting. Again, this is Hilary Doyle, and if you are interested in more of his stuff, and there's a lot of it, just Google for Panzer Tracts or the Doyle Jens series of books. He also wrote with Spielberg. He's been doing this for 50 years. There's a few books out there. Anyway, so as I said, he's my primary source when I do a lot of the German stuff. So plug.
Thank you, Nicholas.
All right, take care.